not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. We want to see each other. Let me stay in your golden time space while we talk.
Welcome to episode 21 of Quarantine. I'm Peter Hirschberg, and if you've been following us, you've noted that this is an experiment that we've been doing for over 10 weeks now. And at the very beginning, we were interested in exactly what was happening in this lockdown. How were we changing our lives in this moment of quarantine? And then we kind of moved through this phase where we were interested in how would the world be different? We started looking at what was going on with cities, what might be going on in communications media. Last episode, we started thinking about how do we come together in collaboration for the world of tomorrow? What gets built next? Well, that's a big theme of today's show, and we have a wonderful group of people. We really want to get into how is place going to change? There's all this conversation about, well, are we going to be going back to office buildings, and which cities will win or lose? Tech companies are telling us that a lot of people are going to stay at home, and how much staying at home would significantly change the way that we look at things. Design becomes a very important issue. We have new technologies. We're virtual, we're real. What does that look like? And then how might this be an advantage for our heartland cities? Okay, well, today we have an amazing group of people to help us think that through. So I think we should just bring them all on now. First of all, here's my host, Mickey McManus. Hello, Mick.
Hey, Peter.
Okay, and you will be bringing with us today our Miro whiteboard, which is our memory of the last 20 episodes and a record where we're headed.
Yeah, this is what we're working on today, a sense of place, Zoomtowns, Boomtowns, or more. But if we kind of scroll a little bit back, it's an infinite board, so we're kind of far out when I'm lucky to be able to get the scroller to work. We can take a look at an episode a little while ago. This was with Steve Jurvetson and Andrew Hessel, Synthetic Bowsers, talking about building foundries. And we can go back and kind of see it and get a sense of things and be able to kind of pull in and pull out and understand what's going on. We're just playing around with it. Anybody can go onto our Miro board and comment or even help us draw. This is a collaborative infinite whiteboard, and we'll post the links in the comments, and it's also on our home site. There's just a little area that says Miro, and if you click on it, you can join and draw along. But it's just an experiment in trying to get collaborative cognition going on complex things.
Excellent. On today's show, we're going to have Jeremiah Owyang. Hello, Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is coming to us from his studio in his Airstream tractor trailer. Jeremiah, we're going to come back to you in a moment. You are a top industry analyst. We've known each other for years, and you've been having a conversation with Silicon Valley about the future of this industry.
Yes, and thinking about what does the meaning of cities versus urbanization, hubs and spokes. I look forward to getting into it.
And also with us today is Ashley Arendt. She was the creative director of Amazon Go, which was the retail store with a great deal of automation, including no cash registers, and also has been leading a lot of innovation at Microsoft. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
You have been doing so much work at the confluence of space and design and new technology, and it looks like this is a moment that suddenly that kind of design thinking will help us understand cities and space.
I certainly hope so. It is a very exciting time. This opportunity for digital and physical integration might have seemed more kind of discretionary or optional. I think it's quickly becoming imperative and necessary. So delighted to be here with you today.
You know, so
Ashley is now a part of BCG's Smart Environments office. So she has now started to look at a whole bunch of different organizations trying to figure this out, and the boundaries between digital spaces and physical places, which I think is going to be really part of the topic here. How do we put people first? And Ashley is an experienced designer, so I think it's really important for us to remember the human dimension on all this.
And
Absolutely.
a thing we've seen over and over in this show is the future, which was supposed to be 10 or 15 years out, like showed up, right? Okay, so excited to get into that. And then joining us, our good friend, James Fallows. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Peter. Great to talk with you. And Mickey, I'm here from Washington, D.C., so I'll hope to bring a different kind of ethic than the civic spirit that is surrounding me at this instant.
Yes.
More.
And also, we often get caught up in our West Coast innovationness. Of course, it's nice to have the establishment and the rest of the country check in with us. And you have kind of been our man in the rest of the country. Your career was about being a foreign correspondent, and then the foreign country you came to was America's Heartland.
Yes, my wife Deb and I, as we've discussed in the past, have been traveling for years and years through smaller cities. We actually spent much of last year making a movie with HBO based on our book, Our Towns, which will be out later this year. So I hadn't been in DC for a long time, but now I've been no place else for the last 3 months.
Okay, so we're going to turn to you. Is this America's Heartland moment? As we hear about tech dispersal, does this get picked up by secondary cities? Or are there devastating issues there? So we look forward to getting into all of that. What a great show today. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Jeremiah, let's start with you.
Sounds good.
You know, you're always in conversation with Silicon Valley, and you had a very interesting Twitter post last week in which you challenged people to this poll, which we could put up. You asked, if you took a pay cut, would you take that in return for staying home? And the answer seemed to be a resounding yes. Tell us about that.
It was really interesting. So first of all, this is not scientific, but I do scientific research surveys, but I use Twitter just to kind of sense the network. Obviously, I'm attracting business folks, tech folks, and essentially I asked them, if you could stay home and work from home for the rest of your career, as we saw Twitter announce that capability, would you do so if you could take a 10% pay cut? And of course, there's lots of reasons why people might do that, because you could move to a bigger house out in the suburbs, or you could do an ROI cost-benefit analysis, and commuting every day could equate to more than 10%. And so the findings were that 44% of the respondents said they would take that deal and work from home on a consistent basis going forward. And so that was a big thing to see.
Yeah.
And how big of a survey was this? How many people?
I don't know. Can we pull that up? I think one of them was like 700 or something. You know, is over 500. I do polls on a frequent basis, and
here we have 717 votes.
Yeah.
And okay, and this, of course, was going on right at the same time,
right?
That Mark Zuckerberg was saying, "Oh, we're going to be dispersing people, and you'll be taking a pay cut."
That's right. And that happened at that point. And at the same time, there's a debate whether or not people are more productive or less productive. I've done polls on that while they work at home. And now the interesting thing on this poll, also, I also have it open, is 31%. Oh, there we go. Did this motion? No, you take that. I'm not taking that deal. I'm out of here. I'm going to find another job. Were they just saying that in spite because of the news cycle was so nasty around people potentially having a reduction in pay when they move to different areas? So the way that it was announced from Mark Zuckerberg is on January 1st, 2021, they will change comp based upon where location is. And this really upset people. People were saying, I'm working more hours at home. I am just as valuable, if not more valuable. You don't have to pay for office space. I'm taking that cost in my own house, increased electricity. You should pay me more. But a cost of living adjustment called COLA isn't a new thing at all. This is a normal thing. But here's where it got sticky and where technology comes into this. He said that we will actually look at your IP address on an occasional basis, but it's based on trust, of course, but just to see where you really are in the world. So there was a lot of heat in this discussion. Of course, this triggers other things around where will people live. The last thing is that about a quarter of these folks said, you know what, I will continue to go into the office, and the assumption is that you would keep that same amount of pay, that 10%. So that's the interesting findings. I think it's directionally correct. I do think there was some knee-jerk reactions with, I'll seek another job. Do you really think 1/3 of people will say no over 10%? I don't know. So that's where it is.
So one of the questions this raises is winners. And by the way, Mickey, generally at this point in the conversation, when we were talking yesterday, you came in with a moral question about whether this pay cut thing might be good because it balances things out across America, or in fact, it's just another form of extractive capitalism because they're just, okay, here, the same work's getting done, they're paying people less, and it's concentrating.
Well, yeah, no, I do think there's an interesting thing here. First, we also have value falsification. What people say they do and what they actually do, or what they actually need, or what they actually value, aren't necessarily the same thing. What people say in a poll and versus what they actually are rewarded by or feel a sense of well-being from. And so I don't know yet what's really going to happen, but I just was saying, in some ways, I wonder, okay, great, you're going to take a pay cut and you're going to go populate a whole bunch of the second-tier towns and all that. Is that going to actually be able to raise those towns up, or create new Boomtowns that are Zoomtowns because everybody's disconnected and they look for great places with high internet connectivity or something? Or will it really just be another way to kind of get more people to work at less and less value? And we saw some of those things happen with sort of offsetting people so that they were contractors than really employees. They lost their collective ability to do things because they were considered contractors. They were gig workers or something. And it may not have been powerful in all those different ways. Although I'm not the expert on any of this stuff. I think, in fact, Jeremiah has done some fascinating work on,
you see the
on
question,
cloud
Jeremiah,
companies as well. It's a complicated question.
Thanks.
So we launched into the gig economy thing and thought it'd be great, and there were unintended consequences. So, thoughts here?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think we will see many salaries on the coast. People that are based on the coast now, their salaries over the next few years will decrease because now you're opening up to globalization, or at least national-based workers, and folks are going to distribute. We're going to move away from the coastal hubs. I mean, Amazon already has 3 headquarters, right? So we're going to move away from the coastal hubs like Silicon Valley and Seattle and New York, and we're going to spread into a hub and spoke model where we will see people disperse, and we will see the wages in the Midwest, in the South, potentially rise, and in the Rockies, and of course home values will. So we will see this dispersion that we've been craving in America. This has been the rallying discussion for some of the Democratic candidates already to equalize the income and wealth across the country. So I think this will happen, and this is potentially a good thing.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this, so I was talking yesterday to some real estate investors in San Diego doing really interesting things, and their whole thesis was, here's why things are bad, but it's going to be great for us in San Diego. And Riaz today posted something about Oakland, in which he talked about a lot of the changes we go through, but why it'd be good for Oakland. And we have a clip coming up with Kevin O'Leary explaining why it's going to be good for his companies. But one thing you do not hear is a lot of people talking about why downtown San Francisco real estate will be good. So there seems to be a growing opinion that all of the headquarters that had to come here for established companies, you can start moving that stuff out. What's the buzz that you're hearing? In fact, why don't we put up the Facebook post? You post a lot of these thoughts on Facebook, sure, and then you have comments. What's the buzz around Silicon Valley, on San Francisco? What's going to happen? Yes,
so it'll still remain this hive epicenter of, and the natural collisions that happen from innovation discussions will continue to stay in Silicon Valley. Some of the core roles include the VCs and the C-suite of the tech companies. They have their families situated here. They're not going to leave. However, they will maintain their leadership ranks. They will still stay here in Silicon Valley, and the product leadership as well. However, the rest of the roles don't need to be based here. They could be based in other regions. So I thought about, there was 4 different potential regions. So the first region would be San Francisco, Santa Clara County, and then San Mateo County. The second region would be the other 7 counties, including Alameda and all around the Bay Area. And then the third region would be all those that are touching those different regions, including even up to Sacramento. And those folks might come into the office twice a week, and they may make a commute for 90 minutes to 120 minutes one way, but they're not coming in that often, so it's not as painful, or they may not come in at all. And then, of course, the fourth region is San Diego, Colorado, Denver, Austin, where they fly in once or twice a month, and it's not an issue. So I think that is what is going to happen. So let's first talk about Market Street, where there are many tech companies. Those communities will suffer because Twitter has said that people can work at home indefinitely. And they are propping up that mid-market area, and they have deals with the government to bolster that local community. So that's a risk point, and I do have concerns around what that means for that part of the community. So there's going to be lots of macroeconomic changes and micro. If you look at the comments on my Facebook feed, you'll see many of the digitalati in Silicon Valley, from VCs to people working at the big tech companies, all were chiming in, and I could hear the different voices. But I think the voice that is most interesting is my realtor. She opened up her swath of properties to be 90 minutes outside from touching the water, the bay. It used to be only 30 minutes or so. So that's a real indicator to me.
This is really a description of a regional economy writ large. This is, I don't know if you know Patrick McKenna, who has been, doing a lot of work on how do we do heartland investments. But one of the things you see, you started seeing Sacramento or Reno or even Salt Lake. It is Seattle and San Francisco spreading out. And arguably, this is really good news. And I think we'll talk about that with Jim Fallows a little bit later. And likewise, that creates a really interesting situation for San Francisco. Do we have that San Francisco Chronicle article that we can put up? The Chronicle had a piece this morning about why this might be bad news for San Francisco. And on the same day, several new office towers were approved to go up on Market Street. I have a question. Well, there we go. Pandemic casts a shadow on the future of real estate here. One of the questions that comes up here, this whole bit about the density of cities where innovation happens. If we go back in time to 1993, to the dawn of the internet, George Gilder, who was kind of the Jeremiah Owyang of his day, industry analyst, tech person, was saying we won't have cities because everybody will work at home. And of course, what we learned was as we moved to an information economy, there was a premium on people coming together and creating things. And then, less expensive and cloud computing meant open innovation and APIs and Web 2.0. And suddenly it was people crammed together in cities that was the premium having new ideas. So I could get that when Twitter gets expensive, it's just cheaper to send people home because the core innovation happened. The teams are together. But when it comes to founding and starting things and that innovation thing, does that happen in secondary cities, or do we still need our dense places for that?
I'm hearing many stories of young startups still operating in a virtual model, but the question is, how do they meet? How do they catalyze? And I think that's a really good question. Those collisions still need to happen. Are they in meet space? Are they in physical space? And they're also augmented digitally? I think it's a combination. I don't really know what this looks like. I definitely see the VCs hosting their own online chats, trying to reach out to the entrepreneurs and trying to catalyze those conversations. I really don't know.
Well, and I wonder in some of this stuff if the emergency, that we're in this emergency, is matching to the sort of pace layer, the time horizon that it takes to build property, the time horizon it takes to build teams, the time horizon and if the emergency kind of thinking, where we're all feeling crazy levels of stress and we're trying to look at the good stuff, we're having probably more intimate conversations with each other, senior leaders and teams and prospects, if you're trying to figure out, working with a new group or something than ever before in some ways, because you're seeing everyone's whole life in front of them, because the work-life balance, the contract has been kind of shredded, where you're at and where your family's at and where your kids are at and things. And I just wonder how much of the reaction right now will last 10 years from now. There's real estate time, or 50 years from now in terms of infrastructure time. And how much of that will be something we look back on and go, why did we do that? Why didn't we just figure out how to be back together again? Because we love being together, and we know that cities seem to have a fractal model to them that end up being far more efficient for the planet, far more environmentally friendly than dispersed populations. So there's a whole weird set of things here. I think a big part of the thing I worry about with new startups and new things is, yes, if it's all digital, a bunch of people can work at home. And if all the digital players of the last generation, the Twitters and the whatevers, are saying, hey, I can do it all from home, it's because they built the thing and it's all mostly software. But in the future, a lot more of the technologies are going to be intelligence at the edges. It's going to be things that engage the physical space. It's going to be things that help us understand the values of the real world and the physical world, the sort of Internet of Things stuff. And how do you even do Internet of Things startups when you can't go and deploy rough prototypes in real people's homes easily, and you can't, test this stuff at large? I think it's wrapped up with a whole bunch of interesting questions, and I don't quite know if we're getting the human component to this. We're getting the kind of, I'm strong enough and I can do this, why can't you do this? And then I think of all the people who literally have to be outside to pick up the garbage or to deliver mail or do important services for community-based or location-based things for nonprofits and things like that.
I mean, a little bit of what we're saying here, though, Mick, is we're not saying we'll all go virtual. I think a lot of what we're saying is we're going to go to other cities, right? So some of the Twitter employees will be home, but part of what you're saying, Jeremiah, is this is good for the areas that are 2 or 3 hours out of San Francisco. No longer do they have to suffer the 2-hour commutes. Yeah. They get to live there.
I think I love that point. Yeah,
that's a good thing.
But I also think your point in general is if you can actually find the right talent anywhere in the world and feel comfortable saying, I'll hire you, then we might have cognitive diversity, right? We might have gender diversity, we might have cognitive diversity, we might have age diversity, cultural diversity, that whole thing that would actually help you be more hybrid, sort of have a hybrid vigor.
That's right.
Where you could actually be a more resilient organization.
I mean, that's what a network is too, right? We're shifting away from a hub to this, it's a tessellation as it spreads and diverts out. And I think that is the direction that we should be heading. I think those are all good things.
Interesting.
I want to. Did I cut you off? If not, I want to show something. Okay, so to get a non-Silicon Valley perspective on all this, here's a clip from Kevin O'Leary of Shark Tank fame, in which he was asked about what would the effect of this be on the profitability of his Heartland companies. Let's take a look.
America 2.0 that's much more efficient in how it runs its businesses, because across our portfolio, we're going to offer about 20% of our employees the right to work at home perpetually, particularly in areas like compliance, accounting, logistics. If they wish not to commute anymore, we're agreeing to upgrade their internet. We're going to provide them with equipment that they can stay at home and do their jobs. And what I find so incredible, we're getting people working 10 hours a day right now at home, more than we're asking them to, because they don't have anything else to do. And our productivity has gone through the roof, all at the expense of the landlord. And that sector, I think, is going to have some significant challenges, because we're going to reduce our square footage probably by 20%. And we think, don't know this yet, but I think we can save 5 to 7% free.
This is such a great.
All right. Okay, so essentially here were Heartland companies saying they could save 5 or 7%, both because they're sending people home and they're closing retail locations. So I thought that was kind of telling.
Peter, another thing that he mentioned though, and I'd like Jeremiah's take on this. He mentioned people are working 10-hour days, so productivity is through the roof, and the people suffering are landlords. I was thinking about their families. I was thinking about whatever happened to us having a 4-day week or a 3-day week in the 21st century and actually having more time to live instead of, live to work. And then I was also wondering on the positive side, his comment about equipment at home, right? I think there's a separate kind of real estate deal here though, which is how do you help people set up genuinely collaborative home offices that don't, I noticed you happen to be in a beautiful sort of micro home office from the 1930s all the way to today, the Airstream. So what's your take on this kind of stuff? Will people get care packages to actually have a better experience wherever they are that brings that with, or what?
Mm-hmm. I have been asking folks, and as you might imagine, I constantly asking the market. So I do ask folks on Twitter, mm-hmm. and I did do this one yesterday. What do you need to be successful at home? And then I tallied up the responses. Mm-hmm. The most commonly said thing was the devices they needed. Internet, second screens, fast laptop. People were not ready. They did not have the hardware to be successful. The second thing that people said, and this one shocked me, I was surprised. It was around discipline and motivation. It was around the mental focus and resilience to make this happen. And so the third, another time I've asked folks, and I said, be honest, because I can't see who you are in responding. Are you more productive working working from home during this quarantine period or less. And around, I think 30% of people said they were less productive, whether it's childcare or dogs or just the stress, or maybe somebody's sick in their life, all of those things. So working from home does not guarantee that you will be successful in doing it. I think people need to be prepared, and HR needs to be ready to support them and even fund this with new types of expenses. And also the way that you manage people and support them. And they're not near people. They're not near the water cooler conversations. That could have an emotional toll. We know it's important for us to connect to people. So that's an important part of the community aspect.
I think I love this comment. You know, I just was talking to some senior leaders at a very big company, and they were saying they feel like they really don't know how their teams are feeling when they're not on live, because at the water cooler they were able to kind of see the person just sort of like casually reading a book, or just like holding their head while they're sitting there waiting for the coffee, or you know, all these things that we are as humans were built over 3 billion years of life on Earth to like sense this richness and be off camera, so that we could just be, but also be casually together. And there's no "I'm feeling lucky" button on Zoom that I could wander through some other teams. There's no casually fade in and out of Zoom. You know, it's all right in your face.
There are virtual worlds emerging just for enterprise and corporate. So I've seen at least 3 variants of that I'm starting to dig into. And we'll probably see more emoticons emerge on all of the collaboration tools to enable that. And here's a funny thing, and I know this is a wild thing to say, but I think we're going to see an enterprise class TikTok, where we're going to see employees do weird dance-offs and things, just so they can emote and self-express. Anything that happens on the consumer side, we'll see replicate in enterprise, because they want people to fuse and bond.
Nice. You mentioned that the people want hardware, like a bigger screen and things like that at home. And I noticed that for like Saturday Night Live, they shipped them green screens, you know, so that they could actually be put into virtual worlds together. There's a few decades worth of study that actually just surface area of your screen, surface area of your office space increases your cognition and capacity to deal with things, because you're not always opening and closing things. So maybe this double down is the need also to be able to have your brain not be overloaded, and just be able to have 2 screens or 3 screens. We saw this even in early days of logistics for dealing with disasters. They'd have a screen to see the map, and a screen to see where the problems were, and a screen to see whatever. And keeping those, knowing I look left for this and right for that, allowed them not to have to shuffle all the time through tabs or, you know, all this.
Which suggests that people might have dedicated rooms in their house, and they might move out of the hubs into a secondary or region 2, and might find a house or an apartment with a dedicated room, which the employer may pay for.
Yeah,
I mean, if you remember, a few years ago, McMansions were big, and then suddenly kitchen great rooms were big. It would certainly seem, from a real estate perspective, to go short on downtown office buildings and long on the cool home office with a green screen. Seems like the amenity we'll want.
So, and we might even see the garage convert, because you may not need 2 cars.
That's right.
So imagine a pod slides into the garage. I mean, in a way, this is a modular office. This is an Airstream. This is by design. You can put it anywhere. So we'll see more of these types of things emerge as well.
This is an excellent tee up to bring our next guest in, and perhaps she can join us, because what we're discussing now are these interfaces between the physical and the virtual, and how do we design for environments that have technology that understands what's going on. So why don't we welcome Ashley to these microphones. And Mick, I'm going to let you lead off with this, because you guys have both worked together and have spent time designing for these environments.
Yeah. So Ashley, actually, I want to touch on a few things that we were talking about the other day. In a sense, you worked on the Amazon Go store, and for people who've never experienced this, it's basically almost a robot that you go into that is sensing everything about you, and you just walk into this physical location to buy some stuff. You walk through a little thing with your phone, you already have an Amazon account, and you just grab whatever you feel like, toss it in a bag, and you walk out. And it feels almost like you're stealing something a little bit. Or you're like, you know, and it's a weird thing. But I did it the first time in the one that you actually prototyped over and over again for 3 years up in Seattle. And the first time I was like, okay, this is a gimmick. And then like later that week, I walked in there like 6 times, because I was just like, I wandered in, I picked up some stuff, I wandered out, and it felt better and better. And it was a weird situation. It's also kind of it just felt like, of course you should know me by now. Every damn thing has all this stuff. So talk a little bit about the process, just to get us into what you mean when you take an experience, a human-centered design look at designing something like that. What were the weird things that you discovered that if somebody really tried to weave intelligence and ambient intelligence right into a physical space, what happened?
So many weird things. And I'll start out with just one of the really basic ones. The complexion of the team that did this work was really weird. Never before assembled, I guess, is maybe a more polite way to refer to it. But working with computer vision scientists, industrial design, physical architecture, software architecture, and researchers to understand, what does it mean to create a completely new to the world experience that, to your point about kind of shoplifting, really challenges your expectations about what you're supposed to be doing in physical space. What I would tell you is, yes.
Well, actually, you also mentioned that it wasn't only that. You're fleshing out this complexion. You had architects, brick and mortar architects, and retail merchandisers and people and brand people, so it was all this kind of intersection of different paces and hardware and software and stuff. So I just want to make sure everyone gets that. And
for sure. It challenged, I think, every expectation any one of those individual professions might have brought to the table. We didn't even have the right vocabularies to talk about this stuff together. So there was an approach that I learned there that I've absolutely taken with me to every other situation I've been in, which is show, don't tell. The need to kind of experiment together and roll up your sleeves and actually figure this stuff out in sort of tangible fashion, whether it be space shaping or actually getting the materials and finishes in view of the cameras to see if it freaks the technology out. We used to talk about breaking the store, and very simple things that you would completely take for granted, wouldn't even think about. The level of sheen, for example, on the floor could break the store if it was too shiny or used the wrong cleaning agents. So it was actually, I would say, beyond innovation and actually pure play invention.
When you say like the sheen on something made a difference, like give everyone a real tangible example.
We have a clip of the
let's
Amazon Go store.
I want to understand what you mean by the sheen problem.
Of course.
Just as a gritty detail.
Before you play the clip?
Just go ahead and do that.
Sure.
We argue all the time.
There are a couple of things that are really problematic for computer vision technologies. So imagine these infrared cameras, depth cameras that are looking into space and understanding everything within that field. And I, as an individual, don't have a whole lot of what we refer to as IR reflectivity. I'm not bouncing back a lot of infrared light at the camera. If I did, I would actually disappear. And we found, fixturing, the paint on the fixtures actually had a certain amount of IR reflectivity, and where the camera might have seen one person, either they might mysteriously disappear from view, or maybe two people would show up because they were getting some sort of interesting shadow image. So things that were unknown unknowns prior to the testing that we did together. And I think contactless retail is obviously again, one of those things that has become much more imperative as a point of consideration inside major retailers. And I think the unfortunate thing is it's hard. Some years have passed now, it's less hard. But when we imagine that somehow we'll just roll in a few cameras and achieve something as transformative in terms of its experience as Amazon Go, that simply isn't true. It's early enough in this physical digital integration that deep experimentation is required. The project was in the works for 4 years before we opened the first store, and that's because it was hard, and it continues to be challenging. Albeit, we're aggressively beginning to be able to accomplish things that at that point in time, the store opened over 3 years ago now, we're truly bleeding edge. I would still say it's very leading edge technology, but we have a long way to go. And then there's just organizational complexity too, making sure that you have the IT infrastructure to support something that actually consumes that much data. They are data intensive basically systems of record. They take a lot more energy than a typical grocery store does too. So lots of attendant complexity with beginning to achieve these sorts of things that, as we know, become simpler and more cost effective over time. But it takes those sort of forays into the unknown with a multidisciplinary team to begin to make it more attainable for kind of the not Amazons of the world, I guess I should say.
So let's run the clip
in this stuff. Well, just quick. Now I've got a question. Are you seeing an uptick of interest in this from other retailers that COVID accelerated because of contactless?
Oh my goodness, yes. So much of what happens, not just in the retail environment, but in the workplace environment, it's absolutely part of that conversation too, has to do with how close I'm willing to stand to you, how many people are allowed in a given space, and what I'm willing to touch. So contactless as a basic driver, everything. I had the initially kind of strange experience of actually having someone spray my credit card with Lysol before they handed it back to me. So, our hyper awareness of what we touch and what we're willing to either release from our personal possession or what we're engaging with, I think has the majority of major retailers actually doing some pretty low-hanging fruit. And thankfully, that's the case around contactless payment. But you can begin to see the same sorts of technologies that make that possible begin to make a lot of other things possible so that you can really minimize the contact and be much more thoughtful about communicating to people in the space about their health and safety.
But also the space knows about possibly in the future could be kind of a micro radar network to actually know that just aisle 5 or those things over there, like, don't do that right now, or even tell me, somebody pick that up and put it back, and I would be aware of this, right? So when the space is aware and can shape my experience, it makes something very different happen. I want to roll the clip now because Peter was asking for it, and then I want to go back to system of record because I think there's something about ethics and ambient intelligence that suddenly you ran right into. And let's talk about that after we see the clip.
Wonderful.
Four years ago, we started to wonder, what would shopping look like if you could walk into a store, grab what you want, and just go? What if we could weave the most advanced machine learning, computer vision, and AI into the very fabric of a store so you never have to wait in line? No lines, no checkouts, no registers. Welcome to Amazon Go. Use the Amazon Go app to enter. Then put away your phone and start shopping. It's really that simple. Take whatever you like. Anything you pick up is automatically added to your virtual cart. If you change your mind about that cupcake, just put it back. Our technology will update your virtual cart automatically. So how does it work? We used computer vision, deep learning algorithms, and sensor fusion, much like you'd find in self-driving cars. We call it Just Walk Out technology.
Self-driving stores. Interesting.
It was the best analogy, for the time. And it's actually true. It's computer vision, real-time computer vision. So with depth perception. And that's absolutely the same sorts of technology.
Well, and two reflections of me, and it sounds like one problem, do you know if I'm saying that? But two reflections of the thing I bought. Are you going to bill me twice? So that sounds like real subtle details that as an architect or an engineer, you might not have ever thought of when the space can pay attention to you.
No doubt. One of the other things that I would like to kind of assert, this technology is obviously super transferable from a retail environment. The reason I think, and this is upon reflection after being gone for a while, the reason I think that we pursued the retail proposition is honestly the data collect opportunity, and a high volume environment where you can actually pressure test the resiliency of the technology and get the right types of data. Ensure that the cameras are appropriately recognizing different skin tones, for example. There again are so many unknowns that we needed a beta situation, and obviously the concept is rolling out incrementally across the United States, somewhat slowly, but the level of sophistication and the education, quite frankly, of the algorithms behind the proposition were accelerated by the fact that it is this retail thing that has a lot of traffic. So when you think about it, grocery being your most frequent retail shopping trip, it was the perfect place to begin to experiment with these sorts of techs. So I am excited for the continued improvement of these systems and the ongoing presence of them in our lives, because it truly is, you felt like you were going shoplifting, but it also quite magical, and you can begin to create net new interactions that frankly hadn't existed before.
I want to stop you. No, go ahead. You finish your sentence, but I want to jump in there because I thought you just said something amazing that I want to drill in on.
It just with great power comes great responsibility. I think it's critically important as we begin to imagine these new use cases that we're being really sensitive about the people that they're intended to serve, that the actual users are top of mind, because it is absolutely true. I'll share another analogy actually from more of a Microsoft day. Back to the idea of IR reflectivity, and I mentioned that I don't have a whole lot of IR reflectivity. Certain ethnicities, especially with certain hair textures, actually have a lot of IR absorption. And if we are not thoughtful, if we are not ethically appropriate or really unbiased in participation of people in the development of these systems, we will inadvertently create, frankly, racist technologies. And it's not as if anybody had ever obviously intended to do anything like that. It's simply by virtue of not being thoughtful of the inherent risks of developing this sort of stuff. So it's one of the things that I absolutely champion in all of the casework that I do. Yes, let's create these new things that have never existed before, but let's please simultaneously understand kind of the more dystopian potential futures of this and actively work to avoid them in real time rather than trying to fix something later.
So this ties perfectly to what you said in your last part, which I'm sitting here just trying to draw while you were talking. And who do we serve? And putting people first, right? Which is not what you hear often in tech circles. Sometimes it's MVP, and viable doesn't usually mean viable for the human. It means viable for your back end or something like that. It doesn't mean delightful or magically. It's not like MMP or minimum magical product. But your store feels magical, and I know the continued exploration of kind of just ethical ambient intelligence, or how do we think about that? But you also said something, by having this retail experience, you could teach the store. And I just, that stuck in my head because I'm like, are we going to raise racist stores? Are we going to raise racist buildings? Are we going to raise oppressive ones that make lucky people luckier, as we heard from Kathy O'Neill? Or are we going to actually help unlucky people be luckier because they've already been marginalized? And are we going to actually help level this stuff? And can the technology kind of be raised like we try to raise our kids, as good citizens and as people who are open to that? So it sounds powerful when we really say this. Can you drill in more on ambient intelligence and why at Microsoft you were actually part of a team that had to do with ambient intelligence and ethics?
Yes, that was one of the most wonderful things I think about my Microsoft experience there. For those of you that are aware of such things, Microsoft, I think, among all the tech giants, is probably doing the best job of really articulating a point of view and championing ethical emerging technology development. Brad Smith, the president, just wrote a book recently called Tools and Weapons, to kind of indicate the fact that an invention can actually be pointed a bunch of different places. I know. A lot of engineers, God love them. I love my engineering partners. I just want to invent the thing. And then what happens with the thing is incumbent on the goodness of people to ensure that it happens the right way. And I don't disagree with that, but I absolutely think that we are responsible to our inventions too. I mean, a lot of people, forgive me, it's a potentially or difficult analogy, especially in a week like the one we've had this week. But people say guns don't kill people, people kill people. But what I would actually say is from an object, the gun is inherently more prone to misuse than, for example, a roll of toilet paper. So we can't avoid our commitment as the inventors of these things to, again, really be thoughtful about what could go wrong. A dear friend of mine who is a visiting professor at the University of Washington is actually leading a course on design noir. And I don't believe he calls it that. I apologize. I think he'd be mortified to hear me refer to it. But challenging his UX design students as they imagine, new technologies to actively design a noir scenario for it so that they can begin to figure out how to create a topically appropriate thing, a vaccine for it in real time. So they're not just delivering a cure, but they're delivering, or they're not just delivering an object, but they're delivering a vaccination against its misuse.
And so you said you said this notion of and design noir is fascinating in itself. Like a lot of times people do scenario planning, and it's easy to be dystopian, but we also don't think of like, okay, what if this thing scaled up and became a movement? What if this thing actually became taken over by a megalomaniac, a Bond villain? What if somebody was like, the people who actually do capers on those Bond villains? How could that do it? So it's a great frame. You were saying even though that when you start doing ambient intelligence, you're getting all sorts of weird signals that maybe the person themselves don't even know about themselves. And the question is, it's not like how do they even say that's okay? How do they feel sovereign about the fact that you're able to know that I'm a little warm today and I might be actually predictably about to have some kind of a bad thing happen to me, or God knows what, right?
Well, I mean, so let's just take a page out of the current news. Taking one's temperature prior to being able to engage in a physical space or to be allowed admittance. It's a pretty short walk to something, at least, in our current mind frame, seems like, oh, that's to keep me safe. It's a pretty short walk. And again, I think it's so fascinating because our experience and our opinions are so new with this entire situation. I think it's dangerous to presume how we feel now is how we're going to continue to feel. But I'm pretty quickly, I think, going to be in a space where my temperature is frankly none of your business. Unless there are aspects of the pandemic that continue to manifest in really unfortunate ways. So short walk from biometric capture and biometric data to biometric surveillance. And I think
not only temperature, maybe really my gait, my walk, all these things that might imply a whole bunch of other things too.
Something this really points out is the degree to which things that go on in the tech industry suddenly have become core to both policy and to ethics and to governance. And I remember when I came out and was working for Apple in the 1980s, we thought we were changing the world, but the rest of the country just figured we were something on the West Coast making PCs and it was fine, right? And it was really around the year 2000 and the invention of social media that suddenly all of this online stuff did change the world because people could be slut-shamed or their identities could be held. And then we were eliminating jobs. And now we come to this moment, as current as this morning with the president and Trump, where kind of our fundamental constitutional issues of how we both protect ourselves, the First and Second Amendment, are being played out in the digital sphere. Okay, that's a setup for the fact that when we talk about these broad warp and woof issues in America, we turn to James Fallows. That was a transition there, but I want to bring everybody back. But Jim, if we go back to the kind of the dawn of the modern tech industry, you were in Washington. You were working for Jimmy Carter, writing his speeches when this was not a set of issues. Fast forward to your journey. You spent the last many years in America's heartland reporting on how it can be hopeful. But then your reporting in the last couple of months have pointed out that because we've had a fumbled federal response, we really need state and local. And then you wrote that kind of piece about Erie, Pennsylvania, which had so many of our hopes, and then a lot of it undone in weeks. So kind of what are you seeing about Heartland response and where does it fit now?
So Peter, thanks very much. So there's been over the last couple of years, as I've discussed with both of you, the message that my wife Deb and I were making was that at a time when people were sort of increasingly dissatisfied with federal level governance in the United States, regardless of their political point of view, it seemed to be gridlocked and not going any place. There was this kind of renaissance going on in many cities around the country, in many state governments, many regional organizations. And this is what something we're making more and more forcefully as a case. There's been a sort of horrible illustration of that in the last couple of months, an illustration with two sides to it. The bleakly promising part has been that a time of historic failure in federal response, from my point of view, where I think the federal government has done as badly in dealing with this pandemic as it's done on any big issue in my lifetime. We've seen mayors around the country taking a lead, and governors of both political parties, and religious leaders, and business leaders from many groups finding what can we do for our region, for our people, to try to include people, especially those who are being hardest hit. We know that this disease is intensifying all the existing inequalities in American life, and so finding ways to overcome that. That's the bleakly positive point of view. We've seen a real illustration of local level resilience and the kind of fabric that exists in many parts of the U.S. The challenging part is that the institutions that have led this kind of revival in many smaller towns, you mentioned Erie, Pennsylvania, the same thing in Greenville, South Carolina, or Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or a million other places we've been, those are the ones that are really exposed to the pressure that the pandemic and the lockdown have placed on smaller institutions, ones with thinner capital that don't maybe have the wherewithal to get even some of the subsidies that the government is offering. So you have the very institutions that have revived a lot of interior America being hardest hit right now, and that is the drama being played out in many cities around the country.
Yeah, there's an irony here, because sometimes you turn on the news and you hear most of the pandemics in the cities aren't getting enough aid. It's pork going to the red states. But when you dig into it, and I mean, this also gets into the innovation question. We're excited for Heartland, but it's really difficult. And on the whole, I'm trying to form a question here, just because there's so much going on. Tell us.
So I'll volunteer an answer. How about that? I'll volunteer an answer. I'm in DC, where the approach is always give the answer you want to give, no matter what the question is. That's
Perfect.
That's the DC way. I was thinking and hearing these, these wonderful comments by Jeremiah and Ashley about the kinds of things, a brighter side of a lot of places that are not right in the Bay Area, and not right in Boston, and not right in Seattle, or even Los Angeles, where they've already been able to use some of the tools of dispersed working to build their own smaller versions of startup economies where they are. And I think that one of the side effects of the pandemic will be accelerating some of that. Not too far from where all of you are, where many of you are, and certainly the Bay Area, is Fresno, California, where a now 5 or 6 year old startup called Bitwise has been really innovative in trying to create jobs for people in the Central Valley and spreading its model around the country. In my hometown of Redlands, California, right near San Bernardino, there's an established company called Esri, ESRI, which is a mapping company, which has transformed that town. There are illustrations I could give you from Dodge City, Kansas, and Duluth, Minnesota, and Sioux Falls and other places. So I think that there has been for a number of years a version of the calculus you've been discussing so far, of people thinking, gee, I could commute 2.5 hours a day and pay all of my income for a tiny apartment in San Francisco or someplace in the Bay Area or LA, or I could come back home to Fort Wayne, Indiana, or I could come back to Allentown, Pennsylvania, and there are some tech opportunities I could take advantage of there. And I think we'll see somewhat more of that. Anything that's important and interesting is always contradictory. So I think we'll continue to see concentration because that matters. But I think we will see, this will be one more boost for a dispersal movement that was beginning already.
I mean, Jim, you and I met at the Aspen Institute when you were just beginning your journey, and I was beginning writing The Maker City. Yep. And we were actually in do you remember it was a conversation on social capital with who's the political polling alone?
Putnam, Robert Putnam.
Yeah, Robert
Yes.
Putnam was saying social capital is going away in America, and we were arguing, no, we see in the maker movement social capital and small town social capital. Fast forward, we write these books, and we saw this growing small business movement in local. Do you get the sense that the tools or what's going on in this pandemic will spur what we love about urbanism, either density, more downtown stuff, young people wanting to go to these things first, or is this more like big companies just putting secondary offices out there?
I think probably both of those things. Again, we've discussed, all of us have talked enough time over the years that my view on any question is all of the above. And so we're going to see, we have seen some advantages to very big companies and having economies of scale in delivery or real estate or whatever. So I think we'll see more of that. But also, I think there are, in quiet ways, reflections going on in millions of households, tens of millions of households around the country about what it is they miss and value right now. What kinds of things you really want to get to be able to do again. There are things about an office that are good. There are things about offices which are just a chore and a pain. There are things about concerts and art museums and public places and parks and bars and restaurants and all the rest that people, I think, are more acutely aware of what they want to recreate. So I think there's a kind of reset of what collective and civic activities we want to have again.
Your wife,
I think I want to jump in for a sec, though. Your book does a beautiful job because, Deb has one chapter, you have another chapter, and you almost look at it from a different point of view. As you're flying over in your small plane and you see how many cars are in that factory parking lot. And you see whether anybody can come and get you if the plane's got a problem because you're a small thing. But what you heard again that I want you to just play out of it was just people from even smaller towns thinking about, someday I'm going to make it up to Sioux Falls, or and also the embracing of immigrants in many cases, because in the local towns it was like, we need to get this done, and we're helping them, or in some cases refugees in towns from other war-torn areas of the world, really being embraced.
Let me thank you for remembering and noticing those things. And let me just touch on two of the points you raised. One is about immigrants and refugees. One of the very strongest impressions we had traveling around the country, basically from 2013 to early 2017, then we stopped to write this book and travel again last year, is that people in general thought immigration might be a problem for the U.S. out there. But where they were living, the places that were most at ease with immigration and ethnic change were the places where it was happening. The places, it's not a coincidence that the most anti-immigrant congressman now is Steve King from Iowa, has a district which is about 96% white. That's where there's a real desire to build the wall, but you don't hear that from people anywhere along the border, the U.S.-Mexican border, or in places, say, like Erie, Pennsylvania, where the only way they've kept their population growing is by being a refugee welcoming place. Or even in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which has been so much in the news for the tragedies at the packing house there, where most of the workers in the packing house are immigrants and refugees. And the conservative Republican mayor of Sioux Falls, Paul Tenhaken, has been leading a sort of Sioux Falls Together campaign at odds with the Republican governor of South Dakota, saying we need to protect all our people. That is one thing. The other I'll just mention briefly is that at a time over the last 5 or 6 years when people were feeling bad about the U.S. as a whole, and if you ask people how they felt about the course of America in general, they thought it was looking pretty dark. But if you ask them about where they actually lived, and in most regions of the country, most ethnic groups, they felt as if their own part of the country was on the right track. And so this contrast between the world of direct experience and the world of mediated experience was something we wanted to explain. And I think people will value more the kind of contact they can have again.
We're going to bring a lot of our panel back in a moment. I have a question, kind of a broader American question before we do that. This has been an interesting moment for federalism in the sense that states have had to do a lot. States are banding together. You see the West Coast states working together, and on some level, you see states doing their own foreign policy in terms of how they're trying to trade and stuff like that. Today, the president said he wanted to withdraw support from the World Health Organization, and I can imagine there are a bunch of governors that are like, "We'd like to be with part of the World Health Organization." Do you see anything kind of in kind of the fabric of how we play America and federalism that may shift out of this?
Yes, and as we all know, there are certain constant themes in American life, and one of them, of course, is the balance between centralism and localism. That was there at the time of the Constitution. It's been there in various ways since. I did a piece for The Atlantic about a year and a half ago saying, let's look again at the Roman Empire. We always worry about whether the U.S. is going to fall like the Roman Empire. Maybe we should just assume that national level U.S. is going to fall, and look what happened to the Roman Empire afterwards, and the way that regional alliances arose in Europe. And this was based on a book from a Stanford professor about the way all the sort of fertility in creative ways of the post-imperial time in Europe. And I talked then about the rise of de facto regionalism in the US. And certainly we're seeing that in the pandemic and environmental ways where the Pacific Coast states, which are larger and more productive and more populous than most European countries, are becoming their own block. You're seeing that in the upper Midwest, sort of the Chicagoland. You're seeing it in the Northeast. You're seeing it in parts of the South, Texas and its borders. So I think we may be finding more oomph for good reasons and for bad reasons in these regional alliances of thinking we'll find ways to work together. That can't solve all problems because certain policies by definition are national. Starting with immigration, but I think people feel more traction at the regional level now.
And I think this also hits this ongoing theme of both localism or distributed internet technology or blockchain technology or even nature, which is about cells and not a master design, right? We've local energy for resilience. You want local energy, and so I'm just wondering if that doesn't become kind of one of the animating themes that comes out of this.
I think so. I hope so. And here is my calculus as somebody who has lived through a lot of the turmoil of American history, including the year 1968, which was worse than 2020 has been so far. On the other hand, it's still May. So we'll see what happens in 2020. And that is in times of great stress in the United States, which we're going through obviously now, economic stress, social stress, the horrific racial episodes that have been brought to light again in the past week, revealing or emphasizing what's been there for centuries. The question for the U.S. is always, does this lead us in a better direction or a worse direction? And there are times when the strains of the original Gilded Age led, after a lot of turmoil, to a better time. After the Great Depression, there were resources that the country found. So the hope is that in business ways, in governmental ways, in spiritual ways, we think, what are the new connections we can find with people, with localities that make it possible to have a better path after this real trough of all sorts that the country is plunged in right now.
And when you started your book, when you did that original Atlantic article, you quoted, maybe it was Philip Zoccolo, and you said there is this theme going on just under the surface. We hear notes, but it has to be brought together in a melody. And it sounds like we're back again. We see all this innovation going on. That's all the stuff we covered in the show. How does that rise up and become part of the story and create hope rather than what we see on the news every night because polarization sells?
There was an interesting observation that my Atlantic colleague Ed Yong, who's been doing such phenomenal work on the pandemic, made a week or two ago. He was saying that all the polls indicate that most people, by huge majorities, are behaving responsibly now. They're staying home, they're doing things they should, and a very small minority of people are storming the Capitol in Michigan, carrying AR-15s and doing things of that sort, or having these protests of public health officials over the last week or two. And Ed Yong pointed out that the things that help a society deal with a pandemic or that build capital of various kinds are not photogenic it's boring to see somebody sitting at home and being with his or her family, and people carrying AR-15s to the Capitol is very photogenic. So there's this built-in disproportion in what we see versus the sort of the reality going on. So trying to give some coherence and a sense of a chorus or melody is part of what, in our different ways, we're all involved in.
This photogenic idea, you know, the entire 20th century was about the rise of cameras and ways of capturing things, right? In the 18th century, you painted things, and then modern art went through a change, because why should you paint something, a beautiful picture, if you could take a picture of it? And this idea that you know, not photogenic, so much of what's happening now, algorithms that actually oppress people. A lot of the things even Ashley talked about, which sort of the things are starting to able to be shaping us, and we don't even, we're not aware of them having intelligence and kind of helping you, or maybe shaping you in a way you didn't know. Almost all of those are not photogenic because they're happening inside our heads. And until we have a camera for like our state of mind and our being and our feelings and our reflections and our aggregate, it's very hard to make that, you know, headline.
Well, that's why it's so good we have design experts like all of you thinking about these challenges, so you can help us envision it. So this is one of your many tasks going forward.
What a lovely
time. Let's bring the rest of the crew in.
Yeah. And, you know, you actually, Jim, you just set up kind of a paradox there, because on the one hand, we can use these great design skills to move forward. On the other hand, here in 2020, you know, we have algorithms that were built for efficiency or for attention in Facebook, which now have created further polarization. So we kind of have the tech, it's a design and architecture and value set of decisions that the tech industry needs to make. And we're kind of a young industry, and we're led by a lot of young people, and there's a dilemma here. Jeremiah, I would love to get your thoughts on this, because, you know, everybody that you and I talk to in this industry is now aware of the fact that we have responsibilities we didn't have when we were like kids in this industry. And like, when you listen to these challenges, what's our sense for both how we're doing, and even this feud going on right now between Twitter trying to have some editorial sense and Facebook saying, forget about it?
So to pick up on Ashley's great points at Microsoft around AI ethics, and that is a top topic that my firm is being asked about, and every company becoming a tech company now has to think about the power in which they wield, and to do so responsibly. And so these companies, their business models were predicated on becoming a platform and marketplace. Amazon, Airbnb, Uber, Google, Facebook, Twitter. We just enable the transactions. We're not held accountable. We just look for the quality for the customer and the shareholder. But now we have to think broader about the societal impacts. And so all of them are thinking about, what does this mean? But it's not just them. The retail stores are going to adopt Amazon Go and their other competitors in the space. So this is something that is spread far and wide. And I think what's happening right now in society, so let's use the metaphor. My laptop is infected with a horrible virus, and when I restart it, it's still there. It won't go away. I try to remove software, I try to clean it manually, it doesn't work. So what I have to do is I have to reformat the operating system, which is to wipe it clean, and then I can put on the apps. Yes, I probably lost some data or preferences, but I can restart. And we're actually going through that period right now, and we have an opportunity to wipe the slate clean and reformat Earth if we so desire. So that is the opportunity. And by the way, the virus isn't just corona, to the points that James was bringing up. There are some societal viruses that are not bacteria.
Ashley, you mentioned that you know, you're raising these stores, and people have to manage those things. So effectively, they're workers, and they're going to be distributed workers. They just happen to be physical places, whether they're home offices or whether they're in Sioux Falls or whatever. And someone's going to have to actually deal with a machine learner that has a physical place that got bad training data, and put it on probation, just like you have to do that if you end up with an employee that has a bad thing. Tell us a little bit about your reaction to what Jim has been talking about and what Jeremiah has been talking about.
Such an interesting conversation. I find myself thinking about a few different dimensions of it. And Jeremiah, I don't disagree with you. We have such a remarkable, I mean, what is the somewhat cavalier statement, but, don't let a good crisis go to waste. There is, we've drained the swamp. We've seen the fragility and the lack of resiliency in so many of our systems. And we talk a lot about the success of digital. I don't know about you guys, but I actually find many aspects of the digital experience that I am limited to quite unsatisfying. I'm about the zoomed out, present company, absolutely accepted. And I find myself potentially more exhausted at the end of the day than I had been if I was running around, all over town. Pixels under glass are a poor substitution for human engagement. As a creative practitioner, one of the things that, I know it's a really great meeting if I end up sitting on the floor. Because I have lost all sense of physicality, and I am simply gelling with the people I'm speaking to. And that's we don't call it chemistry in the room for nothing. It actually is chemistry. There are pheromones. There is something that happens when people are in close proximity that can't, I hesitate to say can't yet be created, because I suspect that we could probably figure out a way to do it digitally, but all that by way of saying, I think we're going to have to get really thoughtful about what kind of invention needs to happen both physically and digitally. And it doesn't mean just where they come together, but what they are individually. Kind of reflecting back on the workplace conversation, it's fascinating to think about the access to, I'll call it higher employment. I'm going to get a little over my skis here, but as I was listening to us speak, I was thinking about the GI Bill, which was such a profound influence on American culture because it gave people access to education. I'm wondering if we're actually looking at something similar in terms of access to higher employment, or to kind of more knowledge worker access. And could we be as thoughtful about this as a cultural shift as the individuals that perhaps didn't even know what they were actively doing back in that point in time, but it profoundly changed, and I think in many ways improved American culture. I hope that same thing for us now. But my suspicion is we're going to be looking at really getting very clear on what digital is good for and what physical is good for, and being much more methodical about it.
Almost what is native or authentic in digital, don't give that up, because we live in, there are biophilic design patterns. There was a 10-year study in Chicago with Chicago school kids. They actually just took paved over playgrounds that had been paved over for years in public schools and turned them back into little places with grass and with trees. And over 10 years, controlling for every neighborhood in Chicago, the scientist was able to demonstrate incredible uptick in test scores because they walked outside, because the trees have not pheromones, but they have something, because we've been with them for a long time. Reduction in health problems and things like that. And we're not saying that as, okay, yeah, you're going to give me $1,000 for a package to upgrade my thing. That has nothing to do with 3 months from now. That has nothing to do with us walking in the park together as a team and bonding and having the trees actually help us bond and helping, all those things that we thrive on. So I'm excited by you saying that, because I think we've got to remember this stuff.
There's an interesting segue to Jeremiah here. Jeremiah, before we had all this conversation about COVID in cities, you were early on really focusing on wellness and wellness technology as a key part of tech coverage. And one of the things we learned as we all went highly virtual in the last couple of months, as we've said here before, we all felt like a brain in a jar. When we use Zoom to connect, we have these physical connections, we kind of went nuts. And this and to your point, Mickey, this also points out that as we build more of this technology, we're losing something. And then how do we use technology to either monitor it or bring it back? And I'd love your thoughts on kind of what you're hearing from clients on that and how tech helps ground us again.
Well, it's interesting. The tech companies that I'm working with are focused on emotions and empathy in even the software products that they would build. And this is not native to them at all. And I'm actually surveying I'm partnered with Ring Central, which enables telecommunications among teams, and we're doing a survey on emotions of workers and to figure out, do they feel more lonely or connected using digital technologies, and when should you work together and collaborate, and when should you work apart? And Mickey, you were talking about the parents. It depends on what is the task at hand. And then, of course, Nicole Bradford's watching the stream. I see her on the Facebook. She is the expert when it comes to trans tech. So she's many of our mutual friends. So she knows how the mind and transcendence and self-actualization is becoming analyzed, digitized, amplified through technology. And so that's a whole movement amongst itself that is now moving into companies. What's interesting is most of these companies have launched, HR departments have launched employee well-being programs, but they weren't ready for COVID. So this is something new to them. So it is something I'm seeing from the product side of companies, from the HR departments. It is really a topic that is emerging, is the mind, emotions, and mood.
Hey, Jim, what do you think in terms of this notion of the hub and spoke model that Jeremiah talked about, and the infusion of the spokes into places that, it might be an employee who always wanted to go back to Sioux Falls or something, but they happen to be in San Francisco or whatever. What do you think that'll do to the local kind of community, and how might that help or hinder? What do you see? What's your instinct on this?
So even in the before times, we saw a number of examples of that, of people who had worked in San Francisco and decided they really wanted to be, I'm thinking a specific case back in Fort Wayne, Indiana, or in Duluth or other places. And I think we'll see an acceleration of that, while we still see the biggest cities playing a role. You were mentioning earlier the downtown real estate issue. I think that's a serious one. I would not personally want to be in commercial real estate at this moment, but I think we'll see probably an increase in the people who have seen the world and feel as if the next place they can be with their children, with their family, with scale is a smaller city. I wonder if, as I did with Peter, I could answer a different question, which
of course.
What both Jeremiah and Ashley were saying, which was this idea of responsibility from the tech industry. And I think it's important to recognize there's been no technology in human history that has ever been purely good. For every invention there's been, it's had both destructive and constructive implications. We're talking about chemicals, which both cure people and poison people, and aviation, which was, for transport and warfare, and anything on the list you can find out. And there is I think we need more refinement on what are the conditions in which all of the confluence of digital technology now can have more of its beneficial applications and fewer of the harmful ones. And I think one thing we see, and I'd say in particular, the Microsoft versus Facebook contrast, is maturity, both of the company and the people running it. And Microsoft is a relatively mature company now. Facebook is not. And also, there are corporate governance issues, which I think mean different things in the behavior of those companies. The other is,
you might have even reported on the Microsoft antitrust stuff back when that was like a big deal, and
yes,
Congress every day, and like we can't even remember that far back. But they had to shift,
and that's the other point. A lot of today's digital economy was made possible by the Microsoft antitrust case. And so there are times when the government says, all right, we need to set certain standards here. So I think both corporate maturity and federal policy or state policy have a role.
It's worth
by the way, I noticed that Surya Ivanka, who used to lead some design at Microsoft, friend is watching this as well. I think they started committing to this idea of not being the know-it-alls, particularly when Satya Nadella took over. More recently, and instead be the learn-it-alls. And they really embrace Carol Dweck's, kind of open mindsets, the idea of growth mindsets. And I've seen it in person, like a difference at this place that I used to think of as the evil empire is pretty different now. And I think that goes to your maturity model, this notion that how do we learn as fast as we can? How do we really grow from this? Not just, keep hitting our head against the wall and expecting a different response. And that just feels very exciting.
And it's interesting to point out when that trust case happened, Microsoft was not a mature company then, right? It got hit with that, and Gates's response was to be a bully. And by the way, that whole thing itself came about because there was a ballot initiative in California during the first internet bubble that was going to basically allow people to sue companies where their stock went up and down. It's called the Larac Initiative. And that got John Doerr and Apple and Oracle and a whole bunch of people organized to defeat it. And once that was over, all these Silicon Valley companies were organized, and they were wondering, we're organized, what do we do next? And they came up with a plan to go after Microsoft, which had no immune system, wasn't mature, and got blindsided, and then eventually became mature. Fast forward to today, and we see this characterization of the difference. Also watching the show today is Charlie Firestone, who led the Communications Society program at the Aspen Institute.
Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Charlie. Okay, but this issue of how you actually bring in thoughtful ethics in this tech conversation. For example, in America, we love liberty. Everybody loves the First Amendment. I can say whatever I want. And, that's kind of the whole Zuckerberg thing. We can do whatever we want. And it's almost heretical to say, well, no, we can't have every conversation. But the other side of liberty is responsibility. We don't know that as well. And so I think one of the interesting questions is, where and how do we introduce this conversation among young people or among tech people? Because, everything we're doing is kind of governance these days.
And for me, just to pile on there for a second, I think so I've spent most of my working life as a magazine writer, as a journalist. And even though journalists have never been beloved by the public wherever they are, you are taught early on in this business that there is power and there's responsibility. All the big sort of theorists of the press say, you have rights, but you need to think about how they can be misused, et cetera. My father was a small town doctor after being a Navy doctor. Obviously, the medical profession is taught about its balance of responsibilities. I think the tech world has been slow to recognize that it too needs to have that professional formation of these are tools that can be used, as they say, for good or evil. And you need to think about both sides of that equation.
I want to point out something that I think is interesting. Back when we were writing Trillions and doing the research for sort of how would you have a trillion node world, which we're kind of moving towards with what Ashley's working on, you actually look for what communities of practice look like when you have to take something very powerful and build kind of the building code or the electric code or the plumbing code. And it turns out that's a Bible. I mean, it's treated like the Bible, like you do not go against this code. And when we were researching this, we looked at it and we were like, wait, we are like 60, 70, depends on your counting, 20 years into this tech revolution. And there's no code for how you manage, install, and maintain complexity at all. We just have geek squads in the hopes that maybe enough geek squads in the world could fix us, or our children could figure out and be our IT managers when we can't figure out how to reboot our drives. And yet, the plumbing code is a very simple example. There are no sinks that can be installed anywhere in the world with the faucet below the level of the sink. Why? Because it turns out in small towns a long time ago, if you had dirty water and the faucet went below it, it could sump it in and poison the water well, and people died. No circuit breakers are allowed to be in your basement of your house closer than a meter from a wall. Because if you touch the electricity, you bounce off the wall, you bounce back into the electricity, you bounce back off the wall, and you set up a crazy loop. It's just built into the code. It is part of the Bible of hard lessons of
So we're seeing some of that. For the first time, we're seeing Apple and Google working together on a standard during a point of crisis, right? With the contact tracing app. Like, that was a pretty big milestone to see those two arch enemies saying we will collaborate to hit almost 99% of all phones to track this virus. Obviously, the adoption hasn't really fully launched yet, but the point is that they made that choice during crises. That is a signal that we can reformat society. That is the opportunity.
Well, and Mohib just mentioned that this policy, this idea is called the bus policy. If you get hit by a bus tomorrow, will anybody else know how to maintain that damn thing? And I think that's a good. He works at Amazon, and I think it's an important comment. I think you're right about this contact tracing, particularly the privacy preserving contact tracing stuff. Where the phones are all generating random numbers and just looking at if you were around somebody else who generated that random number when that infection hit, right? There are very subtle sort of cyber things that can be applied to this in terms of protection. We are at 5:25. I know a few people have to head out at 5:30. As always, this has been an hour that seems like it went in 5 minutes and probably took an hour and a half. But any last words or comments, just reactions to this notion of, will we have Zoomtowns? Will we have Boomtowns? Will we have something else? What are the kinds of things you're thinking about on a positive note, on a sort of possibilities of what Jeremiah and Ashley and James have all mentioned?
I'll take that first. And Peter shared an article with me prior about the types of people that will leave cities. And that's something we haven't fully addressed. And that article, maybe you could surface that, Peter. It pointed out that younger folks are more likely to stay in the urban environment because there's the excitement. They don't have dependents. They don't have to grow into a family. And I'd also, those that have families, I'm more likely to live in the suburbs. I do live in the suburbs. By the way, I don't live in this trailer. Actually, I have a house. But the point is that we, thank you. But we might also see minorities be more comfortable around each other. For me, it's a non-starter to go to a city or a region or a small town that does not have other people that share my same culture and the way I look and the values and the food. That is important to me. So we may see some of that impact who is actually shifting about in the planet.
I think also maybe age, right? Because one of the things I heard from someone who does a lot of research with people who retire, we're living longer, except for this COVID virus in general. And a lot of people that were the baby boom generation, the hippies, the whatever, they don't really want to retire. They were sold a bill, this great idea of retirement, but they're living long and they're like, actually, I want my third chapter. I want something new. I want to learn something new. And I'm starting to, one of the things I heard was that large houses lead to small lives. These McMansions, when you're older, you end up never leaving and you end up never having, you get social isolation. You never have a connection. Whereas small houses lead to big lives. And this is something that some doctors and researchers in the sort of emerging blue zones for sort of rebooting what it means to have a third or fourth chapter are talking about. And they really want to engage with the youth because they want to fall in love. They've already lost some loved ones, but it's not like we're different humans at the age of 65 or 70. They want to find out something new. They want to have a social connection. Aisha Bursell, who's an amazing designer in New York, who wrote Design the Life You Love, recently helped launch a VC startup, sort of incubator, that actually pairs 20-something startups with 60, 70, 55-year-olds and says, actually, life is great when you get older. Design sucks for them. And how do we actually kind of evolve this situation? So it might be the cities are actually, 20-somethings and 55 and 70-year-olds having a great time in this thing. And then, when you're in the middle of your life, go hide away.
Jeremiah, that was Riaz's article, which we posted in the chat here. He's a real estate developer in Oakland. And his point was there are people who are young in their career who have to make these connections to get started. And then at some point when you're older and you've had kids, not so much. He's trying to project on that. And we'll publish a resource guide with a lot of this. Jim, I know you have to leave us at the bottom of the hour.
Yes. So I will. Question we asked with a different answer, I guess.
No, I will actually answer or at least address the question you asked about the shape of these cities. Saying I had not heard that sort of big house, small lives mantra, but that rings true, and also true to what Deb and I saw, where the growth in cities was people in their 20s and people in their 60s and above, coming down. I will say that something we learned by flying at low altitude around the country is you can see how the settlement patterns of the U.S. were so affected by the technology of different eras. When water wheel power came in, there were settlements along the fall line in the east, and streetcars. Of course, there were the settlement patterns of the big eastern cities, and the car, of course, as the big driver of the last 70 or 80 years. And I think that the technologies we're talking about probably will see their imprint in the next wave of development of where the growth is, whether it's more downtown or other places. But technology has affected our settlement patterns, and I believe we're in one of those processes now.
Jim, I have a final question for you, and you can answer this or answer anything. But about 44 years ago, you went to work for President Carter, and you helped shape what we were saying as we're heading into the bicentennial. If you were chosen to help craft what the next president might say, or what we might say going into this race, kind of as a framing thing or a vision, or kind of like how we want to put all this together, kind of what might you advise?
So going into this race, if we're talking about this political season, the simple argument I would make is we are better than this.
Yeah.
This is that is, I think, the essential argument to make. And a version of that is essentially what all leaders of the US history and most other countries have said, essentially saying, recognizing trauma, hardship, heartbreak, and sin of individuals and of a nation. So feeling the loss that people are experiencing right now in an acute way, having confidence of the direction in which it is possible to go, that we've been through hard times before individually and as a nation. We recognize that dealing with it, that learning from our challenges is the way to become better, and then having a plan. So empathy, confidence, and a plan. That is sort of, with those three elements, you can go far.
Nice. Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks. So greetings from DC. It's been an honor to be with you.
Ashley, we want to get your final thoughts.
Oh my goodness.
Reactions.
I was noticing in one of the live comments, we shouldn't presume that physical is better than digital. And I absolutely agree. I think it's a matter of getting really purposeful about what that division looks like. And quite frankly, I'm anxious for a little bit crisper data around that. So I'd actually like to see more technology brought to bear on understanding that problem space.
Like the interfaces between digital and physical. Yeah, what would authentic and native be? Do it well if it's digital. Do it well if it's physical, but actually with people at the center, not with, hey, look, I made a cool hammer. Let's turn everything into nails.
No doubt.
Yeah, good point.
One of the conversations that we were having, if I have just a couple of seconds, and Jeremiah, I agree with you. I think it's going to be a very individualized sort of cocktail of what right looks like.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I think, has to do not necessarily with where, but with what and who. The complexity of information. Is it something that I am better suited to do individually, or do I frankly need other people to do it?
Yeah.
And then what are my personal preferences? Because, I think a lot of us are talking about having the home office. For many of my colleagues, that's not an answer. They've got small children. This is a fascinating conversation when you change it to a school context where learning is best performed. And to me, all of this is sort of mixed up together. From a retail perspective, I can't eat a hamburger virtually. There are still experiences and there's still significant portions of the economy that will never be able to fully digitally be realized. And even if you imagine your richest sort of metaverse futurescape, it's still, I don't think, going to be as good as the real thing. So I'm anxious to figure out how we think about this and how we start to make decisions about where to frankly put the remarkable creative energy that is popping out all over. Because conversations like this, I think, are happening much more frequently, obviously, than they ever have before. And inviting different voices into those conversations, so that again, we're not inadvertently creating very narrow solutions because our perspective hasn't been well informed. I think is a again, back to
you're making me think about this notion of even with the Amazon Go thing, you blended digital and physical. There are things you got to do in physical. There are things, hey, you've already got this thing. It's called an app on your phone. Don't reinvent that. Your team didn't go, we're going to make an app. You just said, actually, no, Amazon's spent a lot of time, Whole Foods, Amazon, all those people have spent a lot of time on this. Let's actually just blend for what works well and respect those. But I think what you focused on was the places in between too, it feels like. And maybe how do we have conversations about how do you design the experience intentionally between the physical and the digital? How do you sort of understand context? Because I think Jeremiah and others have talked about how context matters so much in this whole thing, but we have to focus on this kind of weird thing that's intangible, which is the arrow going from digital to physical, and a different arrow going from physical to digital, and an arrow going into the one where they're both, they're mixed. Thank you so much.
You know what I
Peter,
find about this?
What now?
What now? Okay, let's. I just put out here. So here's a fascinating thing. We convened this to talk about a sense of place. We started in this dichotomy between, are we going to be online? Are we going to go home? Are we going to go to other places? And as we got into it, we started getting into the responsibility of the online world, and that it had a governance responsibility, much as the real world has. And we've kind of come back to this notion of the role of cyberspace in the real world. And kind of where we've ended up is all of this stuff that we do in the digital domain has to be in jazz or in concert or in relationship to the physical domain and to the rules. And this reminds me of this is how America works, right? It's the messy pluralism of America that gets us through, and the reconciliation of ideas. And, we were talking about, Jeremiah, kind of what it was like early on in the tech industry when perhaps we were less mature. One of the founding documents in that era, and I'll just read a line from it now because it's kind of stunning in light of today.
Is it Clue Train?
What?
Is it Clue Train?
That's great. We'll do a show on Clue Train. We should just do a Clue Train anniversary. I was going to go back to John Perry Barlow, the Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace, 1996. This came out of a reaction to the Telecommunications Act. But this is what he said. Talk about a community that was a bit insular and, kind of, I don't know, the survivalists off on their own. Barlow writes, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of the mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you to leave the past, to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." Okay.
Oh.
That sounds like a tech bubble.
But it's adorable, right? It's.
Didn't he travel with the Grateful Dead for a while, though? I mean, he understood that.
But look, it also gets to what we were talking about with James, which is the deep American instinct towards liberty and expression, right? But also the fact that you have to have this contentious stuff with everyone else. And so this conversation here in the middle of COVID, where we actually are in the middle of what, is this a slippery slope to surveillance, and we're taking our temperatures and the retail environments, we pick it up and put it back, and knows who we are. These governance issues are front and center in our, and we're actually arguing, the governance of cyberspace in the presidential election as recently as this morning, with the president and Zuckerberg yelling at each other. So what I take out of this is that
I think it was the president and Jack yelling at each other, but who knows? Yeah, I mean, it's all of them. Peter, before you go too much further, and I know you're wrapping, which is good because this is corn time. But you keep saying America is at its best, and America is at its best, and all that. And frankly, society is at its best. And America, for a very long time, had been an engine and a period of time and a moment, and helped us. And I think the rest of the world is yearning for America to wake back up again. But we as humans are at our best wherever we live, wherever we find it, where we can actually get together in a collective and actually kind of strive and try to thrive, and not just survive, but really get over that and thrive. And I think we have to just remember this. For so long we almost could rest on our laurels as an American. That, well, look what we did. We've done a lot of cool stuff. But I think the rest of the world's like, yeah, but not so much. I mean, thank you, but it's rough. It's rough out there, and I'm an American deeply, but I also love the world, and I love everybody, and I feel like we have to just keep that in mind. I know you think that too, Peter, and Jim and his wife were bureau chiefs in Beijing, and her book about learning Mandarin is brilliant. And even in his book, their book about our towns, they relate second tier cities in China and Asia to second tier cities in America because they were there too. And I think we have to kind of remember that when you get down to that level, it's stunning and amazing because humans are amazing, and we are better than this, which goes back to quoting Jim. And I think that's the big opportunity here, is that we, the collective, are better than this. When machines help amplify the things that we all have as brokennesses inside, it doesn't let us show the better angels of our nature. So I just want to clarify that too, because I know, Peter, you believe this too. It's just America is the rallying cry for this. We're local, and this is where we are. Yeah.
I think there's 2 points here. One is within the container called America, we're having a set of fights and things now, and it's kind of like interesting kind of where we're at. I think on the international thing, think the world is a little bit telling us to buck up. Like, there's certain things you do well, like not kill the World Health Organization, or you're collaborating with us and you do trade. So if you just get back in the damn horse and like move forward a little. So there's a certain responsibility. But it's also true that how do you reformat, to use your term, Jeremiah, globalism, right? Globalism probably won't be as extractive, and it won't be all products flying all over the place. As we discussed last time, there's thriving local resilient economies inside of a global context is a thing. This is an architecture thing. I was actually thinking, Jeremiah, maybe it's not hub and spoke, maybe it's highly distributed self-organizing. It looks like distributed objects as opposed to like
a honeycomb.
Honeycomb
model.
Right.
It's a hive model, right? And it's evenly distributed. There's a lot to be discussed on honeycombs and structure and how that all works. But yes, it is a model we can emulate. And technically, the internet is the honeycomb model in a way too, because every home now is interconnected. Each cell should be able to contain the sweet nectar. That they should all have it evenly in theory now. We don't need the massive hub.
Yes, and that kind of brings us, Mickey, to where we're headed, and this concept that there are a bunch of ideas that are bouncing around that need to reflect and be connected up. And that might be a great cue for you to remind us of our design challenge and our Miro board, which is our attempt to connect those things up. You're on.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Jeremiah. Thanks for joining us. And this was just, my brain is buzzing. So I really appreciate it.
There's a lot to be continued here. This Jeremiah, you and I kind of got caught up this week, and there's just a lot that we can continue on this. All of these conversations are kind of like the beginning of something. And I think that what we'd like this show and property to become is part of kind of a global collaboration movement, or part of a, how do people work together around the world to kind of share ideas and amplify things and play our part in part of that distributed network.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks. Mickey.
All right, I will explain our challenge. So if you're watching, viewers, now's your chance to actually be an archaeologist. So if we can pull up the whiteboard for a second, I'd appreciate it. So I've been trying to capture today's episode. I didn't do a very good job. There's a hub and spoke model over there with a sort of a thing, and some other stuff over there, and this balance between centralism and regionalism. But you guys can help us with this. All of us, you men, women, children, everybody can help. And here's the challenge. So this week's challenge is called Weak Signal Archaeology. And what we'd like you to do, and it'll take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or you can binge make, and you can actually be like sort of the lone archaeologist that discovers a nugget that might help us in the future. So the instructions are here. The Miro board is linked on our site. You can click on it, go right in, and read the instructions. It'll show up here. The goal here is to discover a weak signal in the entire first season's episodes of Quarantine. So we've got until next Wednesday, and I'll show you what that looks like. Maybe you go to one of the episodes, and I'll just scroll through some episodes. Oh, here's one. I'm interested in this area over here. This is when Ting Jiang and some of our guests were talking about how play was a powerful way to change your behavior, not just motivation, but how do you actually build new habits. And one of our commenters, viewers, joined us and said, here's this weak signal. And they just filled in this Post-it note. All they did was click on it and typed in some stuff. What is the weak signal that you see here that maybe nobody else did, or that surprised you of this episode? And you can go back and watch the episode or scroll through it quickly to see, why does it matter for the future if we're going to actually be better than this and grow? And what's this? Why is it weak? How come nobody else is seeing it? Why do you think it's being drowned out by all the noise? And then bonus, draw a picture, diagram, or write a haiku. So all you need to do is find one episode that has a blank Post-it. There are 3 Post-its per episode, and fill them in. And you're done. And then in the next challenge, we're going to try to do what's called silent sort. So this is a design methodology that says, go be an archaeologist. And then we're going to do silent sort with a whole bunch of our viewers and our guests, and try to figure out how these group together into powerful enablers that might help us start co-creating something for the future.
Thanks, Mick. it is amazing how much innovation and positive energy and possibility we can find in both the middle of this and the middle of a really difficult week, kind of on many fronts here in America. But it always feels like when you start looking at how people are working on tomorrow and how we're inspired by the problems we're facing, it's a great time of movement and charge for all of us to go do things, and also time for us to go celebrate the fact that it's Friday night at 5:45 on the West Coast, and it's time to move on. Next week, we're still working on next week. I think we're going to do one interesting show, kind of looking at additional forms of placemaking next week, and coming up soon in the next week or two, some people doing really interesting things in real estate and adaptive temporary structures that may provide a landing pad for things like restaurants that can't afford to be permanent but should be pop-up. What if you built structures that could allow that stuff to happen at scale, or kind of a platform for these things to happen, because the restaurant business will be transforming a little bit. So we've
also got some scientists and innovators and people from the foundation world that have been looking at population health and how we can actually kind of help move a whole population into a better state. And so, yeah, we've got some little things percolating right now. Come on back. I do think next Wednesday, I want to review what people came up with for archaeology. So at least a little bit. You've got until Wednesday. It'll take you 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 hours, 3 days. It'll take you however long you feel like binging on making things.
Because this entire time is Blur's Day, because a lot of us are still at home, but we all have to get out this weekend. In San Francisco, we're told we have to be now 30 feet apart if we're working out.
Masks, I think, for joggers now, finally. That's a huge innovation opportunity, by the way. Maybe some kind of exhaust thing and some fun. People could be making cool products right now.
By the way, and we'll just wrap up on this. I posted over the weekend that I ran from Crissy Field to Baker Beach, half with the mask on, half with it off. I felt no difference, didn't think of the heart rate change. And then a friend of mine who is a trainer, and she instruments all of her clients, are like, no, this is really bad. So there's actually a whole lot of data underlying the whole health thing. We barely got into it today. You gave me something yesterday, Why Things, which is an Internet of Things company. I was figuring everybody's at home, they're getting fat, they're not working out, it sucks. You were actually showing the data that according to like all these Internet of Things devices.
With things, yeah. They're a pretty open platform. I think blood pressure cuff, blood ox, things, but you just put them in your house, the scale and things like that. But yeah, they're able to tap into that, and we'll share it on our site. Some interesting data on people aren't necessarily losing or gaining weight. They're moving around, but that doesn't mean we're necessarily in great shape. I need to move around more. So,
but I'll be out this weekend with the camera, figuring out if people are heavy or not, and we'll get back to you on that next week. I don't think we have anything more to say. No. I want to thank you, Mickey, and I want to also thank our amazing guests, Ashley, Jim Fallows, and Jeremiah, for this amazing tour from looking at space and Boomtowns and Zoomtowns and on governance. It's now 5:48 Pacific quarantine.
Hold on, I want to make sure we also don't do this without Mohib and Mead, who are distributed out in the world, helping us with all the technical stuff, and also just keeping our heads on straight in terms of what's even possible in these times. Thanks, guys. We
learned a lot about how to put something like this together. See you at the 22nd show. We're now officially grown up, so we can go have a drink after the 21st though. So it's now 5:49 Pacific quarantine. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Let's get close, but not so close. From a distance, foreign time. Now we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.